So the first thing we're going to talk about is women in the military, and looking at some of the changes that took place during World War II. Now, in the past wars, women did participate in the military, but not officially. So that's an important distinction that we're going to be looking at, and certainly not to discredit that there were lots of women who were active in the various wars throughout, from the Revolutionary War onward, who were active participants in these wars. But what had not been present was the official recognition into the military. So they were the Red Cross or unofficial nurses before that, or camp followers if you go all the way back to the Revolutionary War, which then they actually stepped into often their husband's position if he fell or was injured during a battle, along with, of course, women who with the Revolutionary War and Civil War actually disguised themselves as men to fight. So that there's a long-standing tradition within U.S. history of women participating in the war, either as support service or directly fighting as well. One of the things that changed with World War II was that they decided to officially recognize women into the military as an official military unit. Now, there's a couple different groups, and then we're going to look at some more specifics, but I want to put those groups up. WAC, or Women's Army Corps, was the one that officially recognized and brought women into the military. So they had, we'll put a couple of things with each, and then we'll get into more details with that. They actually had an official uniform. They were officially part of the Army, which is important because to be officially part of the Army, then that leads to not only with wages, but pensions, retirement, access to things that other service members would get that women never received before because they weren't officially part of the military. And that played a huge role in we'll say training and jobs as well. And we're going to look at that a little bit more specifically here after we just address the different groups. The numbers for WAC were around 140,000 women who were part of the Women's Army Corps. The next group were the WAVES. Now, these next two groups that we're looking at, well, I guess there's one other one we'll look at too, which was a more unofficial, overreaching title. But this next group, and all the ones subsequent from there, were not officially part of the military. So the only one that was officially part of the military was WAC. The others were variants of volunteer groups. So WAVE stands for Women Accepted Volunteer, and so then there is the volunteer part of it, right, rather than the official emergence into the Navy. Women Accepted Volunteer Emergency Service. So a long acronym there, and this was for the Navy. So they were not official, or not officially a branch, a part of the Navy, not the military or the Navy. Instead, they were a volunteer emergency service, and so in that way, they didn't get some of the benefits that WAC did. Of the military. Then you had and for the numbers there, that was around 100,000 women. The next group were nurses, and nurses served in all branches well, most branches. And they weren't part of the Marines, although there were nurses that were stationed with the Marines, but usually coinciding with the Navy and the Army. The Navy and the Army were the two main areas that women as nurses were stationed with, but there were areas with the Marines were present and other groups were as well, or at bases, women as nurses were present. And from there, you had 76,000 women that were nurses, and these could take place as contractors who worked directly with the Army or the Navy, or groups like the Red Cross that also were hired women to be nurses with the official part of the program. The last group was WASP, and this was women Air Force service pilots. And they were also not, they didn't have any military official recognition. They were seen as civilian pilots who were volunteering or serving. They did get some money, but the idea being is that you were like a civilian contractor, essentially. And this was a much smaller group. While you had 25,000 applicants, only 1,074 women served. And that was because of very select specific rules and expectations, and we'll get to that as well. And this was actually disbanded before the war was over because of the controversy. So this was by far the most controversial of the different groups where women participated. So there was a lot of different branches and things where women participated and were active in the military, but WAC being the official. So we're going to look a little bit more at WAC and what was going on there. Women's jobs typically followed conventional patterns of peacetime. So they were traditionally considered female jobs. And so this would be looking at secretary, clerks, telephone operators, jobs that were seen as female based before the war itself. They had there were some other positions, and it didn't mean that those were the only ones. There were women that had jobs outside of the traditional roles, but they were few and far between. The majority of women who were in WAC served within that kind of acceptable role. But you did have some women who were welders and mechanics, along with drivers. But again, those numbers were a lot smaller. Anything that was a skilled job, that was considered a skilled job, were a lot less open, even if women wanted to do them. Now, part of the reason why there was an emphasis on these more traditional roles was two parts. One, of course, just the expectation that you had that women would work in jobs that they always did. But the second part was the fear of women becoming unfeminine somehow, that by putting on a military uniform and somehow working within the military in any capacity, that there was a defeminization with women in the military. Just like we saw with women in the war industry, that fear was still there and present within the military, if not more so. In fact, it was definitely even more concerned, because just the idea, and this is why this has been resisted. It's acceptable for women to volunteer in the military, but the instant that you have an official formal military uniform, that was something that was for men. That was a male uniform. It wasn't meant for men. And certainly the idea, of course, that the military and war were also for men. And so women were invading into a role that was not for them. And that somehow just the uniform itself would somehow make you less feminine in nature. And this required WAC to defend that women, the decision to have women in the military. And how they defended it was to state that that they, one, were doing jobs that women as civilians do, right? And so that's why there was such an emphasis on those traditional female jobs, because then they could argue, like, look, there's no difference in what they would do in the civilian world as in the military world. But then the other part that was connected to it is that they also argued that they're doing jobs that the military had found difficult for men, enlisted men, to do. And what that meant was that these jobs that were seen as tedious and boring, that they gave them to the women. Enlisted men to do. But so that's the translation with that, is repetition, boring, tedious work. White, that would be work for women. Men don't like to do that, but these women are willing to do so, and they're good at that type of work. So look, it's jobs that men wouldn't do anyways. That's kind of the other part with that, is that men wouldn't do it anyways. And that's the kind of argument for saying, well, they're not taking male jobs, they're not moving into a male role. These are jobs that men wouldn't do because they're seen as feminine roles. And so no, don't worry about that. You don't have to see it as they're somehow going to become a man. But there was this constant pushback that if you weren't careful, that they would somehow change into a man at some point, because of this military uniform component on it. The other argument that they made, and they published an article on it, was that the women, they reported to the New York Times. It was the press release from WAC, and they gave a report to the New York Times that said of WAC, and this was again a direct quote from the WAC press person specifically, and what it said is that women will always be a civilian at heart, which is somewhat downplaying the role of women as official military service women, and saying like, well, okay, yeah, they are, technically in the military, but don't worry, they're not really military. They're always going to see themselves as civilian first, rather than as a military person. The other thing that they said was that her service in WAC will increase her femininity, which also shows you that concern of the role of defeminization, right? That somehow, I mean, that proves that this idea was floating around, that there was this constant concern and fear that somehow women weren't, they were going to lose their femininity, so much so that they had to put out a press release to suggest that. And then they went further and said, what women really want is when the war is over, they will go back to a home, married, and children. Now, women in the army with WAC were not married or had children, unlike the war industry, which was part of that. But the argument is right, that they're not going to stay. This is a temporary thing, and that goes directly with the argument with the war industry, right? That it was temporary and altruistic. That it was something that was patriotic, but it was not something that women would stay in after the war was over. That they would go back to whatever role they were planning on playing before the war happened. And so that sets up that it's a big step for women, and certainly is, and I don't want to diminish that component of it. It was a really big step for allowing women officially to be part of the military, and led to an opening for more women to become part of the military in future years. But at the same time, they definitely put it in terms of this idea that women who were part of WAC were only doing so because of this desperate need in wartime, and as soon as war was over, women would no longer be in the military. That this wasn't some kind of career or job. That this was something that was to help out, and so don't worry, you can calm down now, because right, they're not going to stay in this position. And then the last thing that they had to deal with was the rumors, or again, fear that somehow women would become overly sexualized in the military. And that probably comes with, of course, the concepts and ideas of men and sex in the military, and both World War I and World War II. To give you an idea of that, for men here for just a second, the military in World War II actively, they put out posters and warnings through letters and other ways about what STIs, which STDs, like sexually transmitted diseases, and so that's what the STDs. About, and specifically with that, having sex with foreign women could lead to that. And so they weren't trying to stop them. They were trying to warn them that you needed to be prepared, and they handed out condoms to the men. So you do, and then I think I mentioned this at the very end, but there was also the, in one of the women's magazines that was similar to the ones I was talking about with the war industry, it was When Your Husband Comes Home. And in When Your Husband Comes Home, so it tells the women, just expect that your husband had sex while he was over there. Whether or not his life was in danger, it could be, and he has a right to have sex with a woman over there. Be grateful that he came back to you, that you're the most important woman and he chose you. And the other was just a dalliance because of his life was on the line. And again, and even specifically, whether it was or not, doesn't matter, because it could have been. And that's just how men are, and you just need to accept that. So you have this expectation, and so that's probably where it comes from, as far as this fear of sexualization, of women becoming overly sexualized and having orgies or going crazy. But nonetheless, there was this hyper focus on it. So for women, right? So these are both for men. They were not doing this for women. For women, they constantly put out reports that women were very moral. So don't worry, right? They're very moral. They're not going to go sleeping around, and high standards. And then, putting out the idea of, well, they're going to want to get a husband anyway later, so they're not going to sleep around. But they refused to hand out any form of birth control to women, because that would imply that would have to acknowledge that they were having sex. And so the easier way, if your whole argument is no, women are not becoming overly sexualized because of the military, look, we don't even need to give them birth control because they aren't having sex. It's a moot issue. And instead focus on praising women's high moral character and standards. But it's that, again, that massive dichotomy that women had to play within this role within WAC. And you see it too in another of the women's magazines that where are we at with that? We'll put 4 here, that I wanted to mention, that just it's this constant push and pull for how women were treated and the expectation and view of women. And this article was the do's and don'ts of wearing a uniform. Now, this was not an official Army thing. This was in a popular magazine, women's magazine. But what's important with it is that it showcases what was going out to the public of expectations for women in uniform. And the dichotomy comes about because of that concern. And both, saying, okay, yeah, this is happening, but at the same time, there's this fear of, of women becoming unfeminine, and that I think it shows the split in just the population about what the role of women was in the war, and whether that these jobs, yes, they were necessary. I mean, it's the same thing with the war industry. Yes, this is your patriotic duty. Oh, you are a horrible mother if you work in the war industry. Yes, this is a patriotic duty to be part of WAC, but let's be real careful that you don't become masculine in the process. And so they have the first part they start with is the don't. So we'll look at the don't the don't category, and I'm not going to list all of them. I'll read off them, but I'll put a few of the key ones here. So the first one is don't cut your hair very short. Right. So the idea being that if the women went, then they were wearing a uniform, that cutting their hair short would make it look masculine. It even says, here's the exact quote: "Don't cut your hair very short. A mannish effect is the last thing you want." But at the same time, don't wear long flowing hairdo. So you're not supposed to cut your hair very short, but you also aren't supposed to have super long hair. So it's this, and all of these do's and don'ts create this super tiny margin of apparently where you're acceptable, and it's a very, very narrow margin. Don't have a shiny undressed face. Don't lean over, which means don't have, you should need to have some makeup on. Don't lean over backwards to look serviceable. The result is too hard on your public. That means don't look too much like military, right? Because the public can't handle that. I mean, that's their argument for that one. Don't wear long nails. They're not practical. Don't paint them luridly. Don't wear frivolous shoes with high heels, open toes, open heels. Don't wear jewelry except a watch, Don't wear a uniform in a nightclub, a cocktail lounge, or a bar. Don't wear it in the evening unless you're on assignment. Oh yeah, don't wear a uniform. Don't wear a uniform in public unless on duty. So this idea of that you shouldn't, as soon as you are done with your work, you should change and go back to civilian clothes, because the public doesn't want to see you walking around in your uniform. Don't smoke or drink in public while in uniform, which again, this was perfectly acceptable for men to do in uniform. In fact, they went around in their uniforms all the time smoking and drinking. But for women, it again was seen as unseemly. And this is what was connected to it. Don't smoke or drink in public while in uniform. Don't swagger or stride along in masculine fashion. Don't assume a self-righteous air as if you were doing more for your country than other women. Don't wear a uniform unless it has real significance. So the idea that there was the that hyper concern about looking masculine, and that the public can't handle women within that structure. So the do's: do choose a feminine coiffure that, but pick something simple, easy to manage. So don't cut your hair too short. Don't wear a long flowing hairdo, but do have a hairdo that's simple and easy to manage. Do cut your hair shorter, but then again, right, not too short. So we'll put that one. Do cut your hair shorter. So do cut your hair shorter, but don't cut your hair very short. Don't wear your hair in a long flowing hairdo, but do have something that looks nice. Do look finished as well as scrubbed. Do look finished as well scrubbed. Be conservative. Use any makeup you require to get a fresh, pretty mind on the job appearance you should have. So do wear some makeup, but the look is supposed to be the fresh, pretty, mind on the job look, whatever that translates to, which is basically don't wear no makeup. Do wear some makeup, but don't wear too much makeup. Do keep your nails rounded. Do wear sturdy low-heeled shoes. Do think before you add a gadget. Is this really useful? Do make it a personal and flexible rule never to wear a uniform except when on duty. So do, which is basically don't wear the uniform in public, but do make it a rule to never wear the uniform in public. And this is again the idea that the public can't handle seeing a bunch of women walking around in military uniform. Do wear it modestly. So there is the concern of over sexualized women, right? You gotta look modest. And do earn your uniform. But the do's and don'ts, the key with this, and the point of why I wanted to read these is to just to show this crazy fine line that the public was kind of expecting women in the military, now that they were officially part of it, to walk. But it's totally consistent with what we saw with women in the war industry, the kind of expectation of participating temporarily. So, you have to maintain your femininity, but at the same time, you have to do these jobs that are essential and needed in the process. But it's a ton of pressure on women to put this in them, to say, these are this strict, tiny line, or it's somehow unacceptable. Women were important within the nursing position. Where they did resist was with doctors, where even though there was a massive shortage of physicians until 1943, Nursing became acceptable for women as a female role, where doctors were still seen as largely a male dominated role. And that's just consistent, right? It took women being volunteer nurses with the Red Cross in World War I. It took women being unofficial nurses in the Revolutionary War, and then more accepted nurses in the Civil War. So it, it took several stages to get women even to be seen as nursing as a female profession. And so women as an entryway into doctors, especially within the military, it was a much longer thing to go. Okay, so that was the issues that women had to deal with, the constant fear that women within WAC was maybe not a good thing, because it could hurt them in their femininity. But they played a vital role in keeping the military functioning on the day-to-day basis. All of those jobs, whether it was with a welder, electrician, or a clerk, or telephone operator, or nurse, or a driver, all of those positions were necessary to keep the military as this large functioning thing working. And they were essential to having that be successful. Black women in WAC, as most women, African American women, were not allowed in the waves, and none were allowed in WASP. But they were allowed into WAC, although not at the beginning. Initially, it was resisted, and it was only later in the war that they opened it up for Black women. You still had many issues of racial discrimination in terms of jobs and what they could do. Almost all of the jobs were non-skilled labor. And so what, I defined it before as right, the highly skilled, I should have said more highly skilled, like welders or specific skilled jobs, versus clerk and secretary and telephone operator were still skilled jobs you had to learn. But these tended to be more the Army defined as non-skilled labor, and with that, these were seen as menial jobs, which were largely regulated to dishes, food service. There were some nurses, which would not be a non-skilled job, right? So that it did vary, but it certainly was far less training and skilled jobs compared to what white women had within WAC. They were only allowed to, with nurses, treat Black men and prisoners of war. So you still had a segregation of who they were allowed to help, and you had a segregation in the units as well, both in the units for working and living. There also was far less recognition during and after the war. This is some of, and this goes for Black soldiers as well, male soldiers within World War II. And one of the things that's going to happen is when the civil rights movement takes place, part of that push, there's lots of components to it, but part of that push was the participation within the war. and many soldiers saying like, hey, I fought in World War II. I fought for my country, and now I'm being denied the services that other white soldiers, male soldiers, are getting, such as programs for loans for homes, money to go to college, and that's being denied me, let alone a lack of recognition. While white soldiers and women were again still had to have this constant dichotomy and push, that men didn't have to deal with, but both were still hailed as heroes after the war. Black soldiers, both men and women, were largely ignored and kind of just shuttered off to the side, as either completely ignored or ambivalent about their role within the military. And this has a direct result on pushing for civil rights, at least one of the many pieces of saying, like, that we deserve to be recognized within this structure. Okay, the WASP. I said I wanted to talk about the WASP just because it's unique. So we are on F here. The WASP was a controversial program from the beginning because it was for the Air Force. It was for pilots, and pilots was definitely seen as not just a male job, a high status male job, right? For commercial pilots, commercial pilots were well paid, and it was seen as a not only a high skill, but something that was this status symbol to be a pilot. And so many of the commercial pilots were threatened by women participating in this program, because their argument was, which to a degree might have happened with it, but because anytime there's like a feminizing of jobs, where job transitions to be more female than male, the status and pay usually goes down. They often call them pink jobs. Well, we do now. There's a title with it. So, for example, a good example of that is nursing. Nursing used to be seen as a male-dominated force. It eventually transitioned to almost entirely a female job. And with that, the prestige and pay dropped significantly. And so their argument is that if this became accepted and women could be part of the general accepted pilots that then could get jobs within the commercial world of flying airplanes, that the prestige and pay would go down. And so you had these men that were actively protesting this program. And eventually, because of this, it does shut down early. They get the military, the Air Force, to close out the program before the war is over. And because of this, the women do not get a lot of recognition for what they did. Now, this had a high interest in it. The applicant pool, as I mentioned, was 25,000 women, and they only accepted 1,074. It had high requirements. In fact, it had higher requirements than they did for men in the Air Force that wanted to become pilots. So higher than men in the Air Force. What they required is that you already had your pilot's license, which was hard to do for women anyway, which is why compared to like 100,000, 140,000, you only had 25,000 applicants. But that's very impressive as it is for how many women had already had their pilot's license, and they already had to have experience. So you couldn't have just gone out and got your pilot's license and then applied. You had to show that you had years of experience flying airplanes. So again, a much higher standard than the men in that wanted to be pilots in the Air Force. Now, what they did is that they did a variety of jobs within the Air Force. One was to actually test planes. So whether that was one that after it had been repaired, occasionally new types of planes, a lot of it was after repairs and making sure that they were acceptable. They did a lot they ferried planes to different locations. So if they needed to bring in a plane to a new area, but they didn't have, they weren't transporting troops, then you would often have a woman that would fly the plane to the new location. They also participated in maneuver training to help practice the male pilots. They also ferried in supplies. And now, while they were not combat fighters and they were not directly fighting in combat, or often they weren't bringing over large troop forces, you did have 38 women who lost their lives, that died doing their job during the period they served. So it was not like there wasn't some danger to it, especially when you think about like testing planes. And occasionally if you were ferrying planes into dangerous areas, you could get shot down. So there was significant danger to this, even though they didn't directly participate in combat. And so then, like I said, it was because of pressure from civilian male pilots and veteran groups, it ends up getting shut down, and they were not eligible for veterans benefits until 1977, when Congress passed an act to recognize them. So that therein lies some of the danger of compared to WAC, when you are not officially recognized as part of the military, is that WAC, women in WAC got veteran benefits. The other groups did not, because they weren't officially part of the military. And you didn't get pay for injury and death that you could get disability pay for as part of the official thing. So there's a lot of important reasons besides just recognition and acknowledgement of their work to be participating or to be given official positions within the military. Nonetheless, all of this was incredibly important for moving it forward for women to be able to be in the military in the future. Let alone just, again, World War II really being this recognition of that women could participate in these jobs and in society in ways that had traditionally been seen reserved for men. And that definitely was a huge boost on women's rights, women seeing themselves as being capable. And having opportunities. Of course, there's going to be pushback in the 1950s with the suburban housewife, but it's no coincidence that when you have the civil rights movement, you also have the women's rights movement that emerges as well, because of the memories and connections, both from then younger women's mothers who participated in this, and women directly who participated in this, and the workforce numbers never go to pre-war levels, both within the war industry and women being interested in participating in other areas in the workforce and the military that had not been previously opened up to them. So it had a long-term consequence for women in society and the type of jobs, what women could do, opportunities that hadn't existed prior to that. All right, so what we're going to switch to and looking at now is the Japanese internment camps and what was going on there. Oh, let me show you, I forget the few PowerPoints I have with this one, which just shows the women within doing training and uniform. Of course, right, the uniform is not practical. They still had to wear long skirts. And in part, that was the clear idea of right, that they were not participating in warfare. You didn't need to have pants, because you weren't going to participate in that. Although it reminds me of during World War II, you have when they had to shut down Major League Baseball because they didn't have enough men to play. During World War II, and along with some other issues that were going on within that time, but a lot of it had to do with just the availability of men because of the draft. They had a women's league, and they played baseball within this kind of major league women's league to try to keep fans coming and make some revenue. And the same thing, the expectation is that women would do this, but then they would stop when the men came back. And they also, the uniforms that they had the women play baseball in were skirts as well. Shorter skirts than this, but skirts. So there's still that expectation of femininity. I mean, if they had the women wearing pants in the military uniform, I think people would have lost their minds about how women were all turning into men, apparently, within that process. And then here, just another one shows women hanging out with the patches and stuff, and just the official uniform, which again was that key important component of it, is that they had military rank, and they were officially part of the military. I mean, here you can see the designated ranks and insignia, along with different units that they were assigned to. And then here you have African American Women's Army Corps, and that was part of it, is that the WAC designated a separate Army Corps name for Black women, that they were as African American Women's Army Corps, that they didn't even enroll them and put them into the same WAC for where white women went to, but that they did allow them to participate at the end of the war, was still again a kind of a catalyst for the civil rights movement, of saying we participated, we were part of this, we deserve to be recognized. And so that was a helpful movement, not so much of what the Army did, but what it allowed women to begin pushing for, as well as the men that served. And then here is a picture of women who were part of the WASP group, and pilots. And this was, again, one of the more controversial ones out of all of them, even though they all had issues, because of how masculine of a role and high status this was. And I think that plays into it when you look at their dress, right? It's far less feminine than these here, right? This one, and even here with the skirts, right? You aren't going to be working on a plane, flying a plane in a skirt. You have on the jumpsuit, and they have the bomber jackets. And so this type of very masculine look definitely played a role, besides, again, as I mentioned, the high status and pay of the job itself. Not for the women in WASP, but for men, and not wanting to lose that to women. But I think the picture shows a good contrast between how they were still trying to feminize WAC, where with WASP that wasn't happening just because it was impractical, and that definitely played a role within images and ideas of that position as well. Okay, so what we're going to look at next is Japanese internment camps, and what went on there within the U.S., and the loss of civil rights, and really just overall horrible treatment of Japanese Americans. So Pearl Harbor, because of Pearl Harbor, there was an immediate belief that Japanese Americans were potentially going to be traitors, that they were going to provide information to Japan. And so that fear and disbelief and not disbelief misbelief in really racist ideology of that just because you were had some you were of Japanese descent, that meant you automatically were somehow loyal to Japan, led to several acts that eventually led to removal of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. So from the beginning, Pearl Harbor created this sense of fear, and increased just racist ideas. And so from the beginning, you had both politicians and organizations. There were individuals as well, but there were these organizations that called themselves patriotic groups. There are different groups that usually were connected to patriotic organizations, as they called themselves, called for first what they called for was limits on freedom and movement, and then eventually calls for removal. So what happens is that the first act was in December of 1941. The federal government froze financial assets of those born in Japan. So they didn't start with Japanese Americans first, or born Japanese Americans born in the United States. Instead, they focused on those born in Japan. And so you could still be a Japanese American, but if you were born in Japan, then your financial assets were frozen. And the idea behind this, or the reasoning, was the belief that if they didn't have access to their finances, then they couldn't either move around the country and I don't know, gain information, spy, and send it on, and or fly to Japan with that information. And so that was the first step. The next thing you had was an increase in racist talk. Is racist talk and publications. It was a huge movement with the newspapers. You did have columns and things like that. There was some radio programs as well. And what they started doing was essentially dehumanizing Japanese Americans. And in part that came from being at war with Japan. And the other part was just, of course, the racist ideology that was already present within the United States. And so they started using derogatory slang against Japanese in headlines for newspapers. You had racist cartoons, political cartoons that were published. We'll say racist slang. There were also just blatant racial stereotypes that began to be spread, as well as actually news articles, not just opinion articles, that connected this idea that the Japanese Americans were secretly spying for Japan. This created an increase in fear and fervor around the idea that they needed to do something to prevent Japan getting whatever secret information Japanese Americans were going to give them. Of course, there was no connection to what the baker, the whatever job these people are doing that has nothing to do with secrets whatsoever. What secrets were they even going to share? But that's what happened with not only this irrational fear, but then the racist component that was already clearly present within the United States that led to this not even looking logically at what supposedly people were going to give to Japan, where they lived. I mean, yeah, there's no connection to it because there wasn't. So then on February 19th of 1942, the United States suspended the civil liberties and civil rights of Japanese Americans. And they did so by requiring the removal of anyone with Japanese ancestry, American citizen or not. What they decided to do, and again, this was only on the West Coast because that was the closer connection to Japan. And interestingly not, where there was a larger Japanese population in Hawaii, it didn't happen there. In part because they made up a significant portion of the economy, and removal could have devastated the economy there. So in Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor happened, you didn't have removal, but on the West Coast you did. So over 110,000 men, women, and children were told to report to different locations along the West Coast to be moved to camps. And they were given a 1 week notice for some to pack up and sell belongings. In some cases, they were only given a couple days, which of course is not going to allow you to be able to realistically do anything with your property at all. What this led to was that, one, you actually had the government that actively confiscated personal property. So in some cases, they went in and took the personal property. The government did it itself. The army actively rounded up people that were resisting or not moving fast enough. In some areas, they just sent the army to get people. They were only allowed to take one bag with them or one suitcase. So everything else you had to leave behind. But of course, you couldn't just leave your stuff there. So this led to a couple of things. There were attempts to protect or sell property. It depended on whether they knew someone that they could have watch their property. So in some cases, they tried to have friends take over their property and possessions with the hope that they would get it back from them when this was over. Now, occasionally that worked. A lot of times what happened is that the so-called, right, we'll put it in quotations now, friend kept the property or sold it. And so when they came back from the camps, when everything was over, they had lost all their property because this friend it just was like, nope, it's mine now, because they had to sign it over to them to make it legal. Because if you otherwise the government could take their property if they just left it. And so they'd sign it over to the friend with the agreement that the friend would hold on to it, keep an eye on it, or business, right? A lot of them lost businesses this way because, yes, someone could do with a house, but the business were especially stolen, we'll say, because then the friend would just take over it and run the business, and then say it's my business now when they came back. But personal property, homes, things like that were lost as well. They also then tried to have selling the business, property, and belongings, right? Everything inside your house. And the majority of the time, because everyone was aware that they had to sell this stuff, they made almost nothing on it. For example, a house could go for a couple $100s. Someone was saying their refrigerator went for $5. And so people just took advantage. Other times, people just straight up stole their stuff. So the reality is that the majority of Japanese Americans that ended up being taken to these internment camps lost everything. Whether they were swindled out of it, whether they were it was stolen, whether a trusted friend ended up not being such a trusted friend. The places, the communities they lived, the communities they worked, took advantage and treated them incredibly poorly, not only with screaming and yelling at them and putting up signs. There were big huge signs that said that they had to go, you're not wanted here, and then just to lose everything this way was just horrendous, let alone the feeling of betrayal that your country deems you not fully American, right? They basically were treating us as you're not really American, and not only are you not really American, but we think you're a traitor as well. And many said that psychologically that was just devastating in of itself. And many kids who had grown up American felt utterly betrayed by that situation, by the government, and then again by the people in the community around them, that instead of rallying around them and making sure to help them out and protect their stuff or protest against this, that none of that happened. It was a large support for this. Now there were some people that left rather than left, because basically, like I said, outside of the West Coast areas, states around there, this wasn't happening. It was very much a West Coast thing, and so there were people who moved away rather than be put into internment camps. But that still required a very quick leaving, often losing your property in the process too. So even those who didn't end up in the internment camps because they moved away found that they were in a position where they weren't able to do anything but kind of give up their possessions, minus whatever they could maybe fit in a car, which I guess was more than what people going to the internment camps had. But nonetheless, you weren't going to get a better sale on your house just because you chose to move away, rather than go with the removal that took place. And so you had, let's put here, the camps themselves and what was going on there. There were 10 internment camps, although initially not all were complete when they started moving the Japanese Americans to these camps. So many ended up going into these half-done, almost not done camps or waiting stations. And that was also another part of it, is that you did have, which were essentially transportation, or what would it be, like a way station. And so they had temporary locations, and then eventually the final camp location. So many didn't go straight to the camp because it wasn't fully built. And even then, when they did get to the camp, it wasn't fully built. We should put that under there too. They actually made them help build the camps. So they had a few buildings, but a lot of it was incomplete. And so the people that were in the camps themselves actually ended up building and constructing and expanding the camps. So you had places in California, Utah, Colorado, and Arkansas of where they were taken. And we can look at the map in just a second with that. The life in the camps was difficult. And certainly there was, when you first arrived, you were processed, and then you were expected to sign a loyalty. It's not sing. Sign a loyalty. What agreement? That you know, declared your loyalty to the United States. And there were some people who refused to do that. Others who threatened and said, like, I'm an American citizen, this is illegal. They didn't care. In fact, one person who tried to leave, they ended up shooting him. So you had a fence and barbed wire. There were guards, right, that did not let you leave. You were a prisoner. I cannot write today. And they would shoot if you tried to leave. So it definitely was not this, oh, we're just, you're free to kind of go around wherever. One of the things is that most were located in the desert, which of course you have high temperatures, and there wasn't any type of good insulation or buildings initially or even later. The meals were meager at best, and in some cases when they first arrived, there was a lack of food at the start. There was one case of a woman who had a 10-day-old baby, and she needed formula because she couldn't produce milk. So a 10-day-old baby, and they didn't give her formula, and so she had to basically she gave their baby water for the first 10 days because she couldn't get anything from the guards or the people running the camp. So couldn't get any formula and had to give water. So then when she finally got formula and was seen by the doctor, the doctor told her she was a bad mom because she wasn't taking care of her baby, even though they were the ones that weren't, that, you know, the lucky that the baby didn't die from not getting any nutrition. And then you had others who did die from either the medical conditions that were not treated. Was definitely a common aspect of an inadequate medical care, and general lack of a good diet and food and things like that. And so there was poor medical treatment, poor food, and then those who resisted were killed or tried to leave. They did try to make life as normal as possible for the kids. Attempts, we'll see, at normalcy. So one of the things that many people did once they were in the camps is that they tried to divide people up into jobs. Now, this was not done by the American soldiers or the government. This was the Japanese Americans that were in the camp themselves, and said, you know what, we're going to create jobs. We're going to have positions for people based on what their skills were. And so one of those was education of the children, and creating schools and teachers. And so they had they created classes for the kids to go to school every day so that they could continue being educated while they were in the camps. They also had storekeepers, store clerks, who would help with food division. And they paid people based on what they could round up, whether that was food, money, clothing. You had tailors. And so they created this like mini society within the camps, as best as they could, both with actually physically creating the homes, but then within community and society, of maintaining a sense of normalcy, as well as there was definitely an attempt to maintain culture and values during that time as well, having older generations share their stories, connect to their culture, and refuse to get rid of one to try to claim the other, and instead see them as both equally valuable. So a lot of resiliency with the people that were in the camps. One of the things is that the army did is that they went around to younger men and offered them that they could get out of the camps if they signed up as a soldier. Of course, they weren't sent to the Pacific, but to the Western Front. But it was almost like an added insult to injury, that like, we don't trust you, we aren't treating you as an American citizen, but we're desperate for soldiers, so if you want to be a soldier, that's how you get out of the camp. Some chose that. A lot, again, saw it as an insult. And by August, though, virtually everyone on the West Coast that was of Japanese American descent was interned. There was one man who refused. Fred was his name, and he actually took it to the Supreme Court and said that this was illegal. So you do have an attempt at a Supreme Court fight, and specifically arguing, of course, that this was an illegal action, and that he was under no obligation to be removed or go to the camps. Ultimately, he lost, which again shows the state. The argument, of course, was in extreme and measures and what could be seen as a losing of civil rights were sometimes necessary in war. You did have one judge that did write a dissent that talked about the dangers of what they were doing, but the majority of the American population supported this and didn't necessarily see anything wrong. But it does highlight the problems of what happens when you are willing to give up civil liberties and rights because of fear, and especially when that's done on a targeted population based on race, religion, ideology. You should always be paying attention. If there's ever a group that's singled out and their civil rights and liberties suspended based on a possibility because of fear, it's problematic and illegal on top of that. But of course, you get around the illegality of it because it's connected to the idea of wartime necessity. But that's always ultimately a problem within that. After the war, the internment camps end, and people are allowed to go home, but of course home to often nothing, because all of their property and life was stolen away. Many weren't wanting to go back to the community that they lived in either, because they felt betrayed by that, let alone having to start over. And most had to start over from nothing. On top of that, you don't have actual official recognition or apology until the Clinton era. And then there was a small amount of compensation for survivors or relatives of survivors, but right, that didn't help the people at the time, and it still wasn't, anywhere near close enough to the circumstances of what happened. But it shows you how long that was either seen as acceptable or attempted to be kind of pushed under the rug and ignored as something that the United States did. What we're going to look at first, though, is going to be rationing. As I mentioned before, we'll say in daily life, the propaganda is going to take a different role, because you don't have to have the whole propaganda force convincing people to support this. You are going to have the OWI, which is the Office of War Information, and they are basically the CPI of World War I. They're going to focus on the home front, and there is going to be some propaganda on supporting rationing, not going and doing the black market. They're also going to, so they do propaganda posters and signs and ideas with rationing. They're going to do with the war industry, both for men and women, but they're going to have a very specific focus on women and the labor force. And so that's where we're going to see them push things the most, is in those areas. Rationing became necessary because, again, remember, World War II was about production. And so there was a massive need for supplies. And not just supplies, but of course food for the soldiers. In World War I, it was voluntary rationing. They encouraged home canning and rationing, but it definitely was volunteer rationing. It was not required. In World War II, it was required rationing. And so what this meant is that you had war ration stamps. So for the war ration stamps, you had to apply for each family member. And how it worked is that you got these stamps for various goods, like sugar, bread, things like that, coffee, anything that was deemed an essential supply for the war effort was rationed. And that was a lot of different things, because it wasn't only food stuff, it was oil, it was rubber, it was anything that they needed for production, plus all the food that they were using to feed the soldiers. And you still had to pay for the goods. But you could only buy those goods if you had the stamps for them. And there was an allocation of so many stamps or an allocation of how many goods you could have. So for example, sugar, you got, which sounds like a lot, and the rations amount changed throughout times. But they would say that you could only have 2 pounds per month. Right? And meat had certain days. There were also certain days you could buy items. So if you didn't have the stamps, and each stamp was for a certain amount. So you didn't have to buy all 2 pounds, right, of sugar at once. Right, a lot of them were ounces. So you could get, you know, so many ounces of this, that with one stamp. If you had 2 stamps, then you could get 2 ounces, right? And this, they gave so many stamps based on the rationing of what they for each family member. So you had to apply for each family member. Then you had to hold on to these stamps, and then you had to go to the grocery store and know not only what the prices of things were, but make sure that you had enough ration stamps to be able to get those items. And so it became a whole thing. There was a black market for this that did rise up in selling goods without stamps, which then they tried to, the OWI put up posters against. But this did fundamentally change the nature of day-to-day aspects of how you lived your life, as far as having to, you definitely had to plan and prepare before you went to the grocery store. There was a story, different store here. They definitely made recipe books on ration amounts, what you can make with your rations. Right, and just the awareness of that. They also promoted, again, just like World War I, canning and planting your own garden and food. Right, that saves as a way. So this is what the there was war ration books 1 through 4, and each one had different items in it, right? And so there was a whole separate application card that you filled in and they sent back to you. And then once you were approved, you got these books, and then you had to fill out your name and all this information about you for each family member. Here's what a war ration whole packet would look like. Initially, these don't. I have a couple of these, but they're hard to find because a lot of people got rid of these. The actual cover here of these ration books are often, you can find still. It's harder to find them with the stamps in. But so you got this kind of leather book, and then your ration books would go into here. You had a separate fuel oil ration. And here's one from 1 as well. And then you had, here's the sugar, the pounds of sugar that they could get. So sugar was its own separate thing just because of how much in high demand it was. And so you had to carry around these packets with you everywhere you went. Here, this is what the stamps looked like. And so each one had a different code and picture and color, and you would rip off, they were perforated, and they're just like stamps. And you'd rip off however many you needed to buy whatever supplies that you were getting. And then here, so they had all the OWI did all of these different posters to get people to be aware of, right? Look for ounce weight on the label, 8 points, right? And that was based on the stamps, 13 cents each. Look at the point value before you buy. Points have nothing to do with prices or quality. Point values will be the different. You also had this, oops, there we go. The point ration chart, and these changed. So one of the things, right, is that this changed all the time. So you had to constantly be aware of the points to make sure that you have enough, because 1 week you might have enough points to get something, and then if the points change the next week you wouldn't. And then so you have these different, right, all look, I mean, this just shows you how many foods in of itself and this is just some of them. This is not everything. This doesn't include meat at all, which was a separate thing, and sugar was its own separate thing. So you have cans here and the size, and then the points that it would use: baby food, frozen, dry, dehydrated. And this was a chart. These charts that you, like I said, you constantly had to pay attention to and kind of take with you. And so then here is this another one: to buy canned, bottled, and frozen fruits and vegetables, dried fruits, juices, and all canned soups. How this, it's cut off here, but it's how to shop. This was a guide, right, with war ration book too. And they did one of these for all the books. So this was just for war ration book 2. And that's because it was complicated. And so then it shows you, right, use this ration book. You may use one or all of your family's ration books when you shop. You may not shop with loose ration stamps. You had to bring in the whole book because you had to show this book when you purchased that. And the part of that was the black market and trading stamps and things like that. A, B, and C stamps are good in the first ration period. Use blue stamps only. All blue point stamps marked A, B, and C are good during the first ration period. They add up to 48 points for each member of the family. The numbers show points. You will not be able to get exchange in point stamps, so make sure your low value stamps for buying low point food. Look at the point value before you buy. Points have nothing to do with the price. Point values will be the same in all stores. Give the stamps to your grocer. Tear out the stamps in the presence of your grocer, or tear them out in the presence of the delivery boy. Fresh fruit and vegetables are not rationed. Use them instead of ration foods whenever possible. Try recipes that make your rations go further. Your point allowance must last for the full ration period, right? You didn't get extras. And then this one, of course, this is from the OWI. Of course I can. I'm patriotic as can be, and ration points won't worry me, right? And it's that home canned goods. And promoting the idea of, if you're concerned about using up all your rations so that it's not going to be enough, home can your goods, and that or the fresh vegetables and stuff that way, and then that way you don't have to worry, and you'll have enough food. There was another one where it was a girl asking her mom, "Mommy, are we going to have enough to eat?" And I'm saying, "Yeah, we will. You know, I planned ahead," and it shows her with her ration books and things like that. So, I mean, it really was a real concern. It was a dramatic change in how people lived their life. Because again, you had encouraged voluntary rationing in World War I to now a forced, required rationing that was complicated system that required a lot of work, and many women talked about it as it was almost a full-time job to manage your ration books and shopping and knowing what the prices were and paying attention to changes. And so it added a lot of time for, and the who was shopping were women, either because their husbands were fighting, or even if they weren't, the women were the ones that went shopping. The women were the ones that were managing these war ration books, and were the ones that were having to figure out and navigate this complicated system. And so it was a very time-consuming part of life that made Americans more aware of the war and the impact itself, because it wasn't something that was just overseas. It was impacting them in life. Now, the next area we're going to look at is the war industry, right? And this is also from the OWI. I mean, almost all the posters are from this. Service on the Home Front, Citizen Defense Corps, Citizen Service Corps, American Unity, Salvage Program, Victory Gardens. Victory Gardens were from World War I as well. There's a job for every Pennsylvanian in these civilian defense efforts. And so this one is specific to the state, and then you had national ones as well. We'll come back to look at the rest of these in just a second. So let's look at war industry. We're on B here. Because you had a massive push in production for war, you had a need for workers. But while there were still some men there, a lot of the men were now at war. And because the men were now at war, right, this meant that they looked to women to fill in those holes in the industry. But one of the things that they had to do was convince women to come into these positions. And so there was a whole propaganda push to incorporate women into these, what was either called war industry or defense industry. And in part of that was because these were seen as traditionally male jobs. Women were not the ones that worked in the factories. They weren't ones that. Well, one of the problems was that there was a fear of not feminization, defeminization. And this is going to be with the military too. The fear that women would become too masculine if they took up these jobs, or wouldn't be able to do them, was definitely another thing as well. So women became the objects of a massive propaganda campaign to urge them to do their bit for Uncle Sam. You had slogans like the more women at work, the sooner we will win the war. And how they phrased it, was that it was this altruistic position, right? Because the argument was, well, these are male jobs, so how do we reconcile that? So the idea became that one, these were temporary jobs, right? That would women would go back to being wives or in traditional female jobs after the war. The other part of it was that it was altruistic, right? It was patriotic. This was for the greater good. So this was okay for women to do because it was, this temporary and altruistic patriotic thing. Now, the propaganda worked in part from women needing jobs because their husbands are at war, to the propaganda itself. Between 1940 and 1945, you had almost 5 million new female workers enter the workforce. Largely that for the first time, right? It was like a 43% increase total of women workers. And this was new. Of course, lower class women, poor women had always had to work to survive. But you had middle class women. This is who made up most of these new workers that were married and had children that were working for the first time. And this is going to be significant for some of the way that women begin to identify with liking work, like in the video with Rosie the Riveter, and the idea of that this was something that was fulfilling, that they actually enjoyed doing, and felt that they were helping out, do their part within the war industry. Where this kind of culminated in terms of propaganda was with Rosie the Riveter. Now, Rosie the Riveter, they don't know exactly where they started. There was a song about with it named as that. And then you end up with Norman Rockwell's painting, and then later the more known We Can Do It painting, which was not copyrighted, so this became the more popular one. And then this became a whole campaign by the OWI with pictures and news articles about women working in the war industry. And there were some very key characteristics that they emphasized, and this had to do with that fear of defeminization. There was this anxiety that women working in these jobs were going to become men, especially because what you do have with that is so the issues or fear, we'll say, right? You have that they were wearing pants or overalls, that they were working in male-dominated jobs, right? That they were working instead of at home with the kids. So Rosie the Riveter targeted these things and looked at, she was these things, yes, strong, patriotic, altruistic, right? Because then those things were temporary, but she was also feminine, and usually showcasing makeup, eating breaks, things like that. The idea was to showcase this duality between femininity and the more traditional male jobs. And this became kind of the rallying cry, largely with women. One of the biggest areas that they worked was in the airplane industry. And it's where Rosie the Riveter was showcased the most. Boeing was one of the largest employers. So if we look at the images with that, here you have, this one's going to go for whack, right? But you have the OWI again, blueprint for victory, guns, planes, tank, ships, waves, wax, workers. They're all with us to win, right? So this is all of them. It's the idea of whether it's within the military, whether if it's with industry, women are necessary for the success of the war. There were a lot of direct attempts of taking pictures of women not actually working, because that gave a softer side to it. Is yes, they're in overalls or coveralls, they're in traditionally male dress, but you don't see them actually doing the work. And the video talked about how, like, RB showcasing them eating. Here, this one, right, lady of fashion. So women needed to replace men in our essential war industry. So this one is trying to, create that idea of, the fashionable senses, being in the coveralls, taking your work pail to lunch each day. This is the Rosie the Riveter, the Norman Rockwell one. And here you have that combination of both masculine and feminine components to it. And of course, oversized aspects as well. Oversized arms, oversized riveting gun. Here you have Rosie written on it. She's standing on the book Mein Kampf, which is so they help win the war effort. Here, women often wore pins. This one's her ID badge, and this was shown in the video and stuff, but just as a refresher. And you had pins for supporting the Red Cross, donating blood, clubs and things you were on, so it shows that you were patriotic, and that you supported the war effort. And this was only done mostly by women. Men didn't tend to wear the pins. But then she's also eating a sandwich. right? You have makeup to show that she's feminine. In fact, the OWI suggested that women get a break. They get multiple breaks to freshen up, which meant put on more makeup, because that made them more productive. To feel feminine, that they needed to, to refresh ourselves. Is one of the questions. We need to be neat and trim and well put together. It helps morale. And then the idea that she has makeup on her cheek, but she also has dirt. So it's that dirt and makeup. The fact that the masculine frame and clothing. They mentioned too, right? She's wearing both the goggles and the face guard. You don't need both, but it kind of makes it look like a halo. So you had this duality between masculine and feminine, and trying to showcase that they're capable of doing the male work, but they still retain their femininity. That was key with that. Here you have the more popular one, which is definitely a little more feminine. You don't have the brawn and the dirt and all that stuff. We can do it. And it was meant to encourage women, to push women to say, take part in that. So this one became more popular. But really Norman Rockwell's one kick-started it off. And then you have pictures with women in the war industry of riveting. You had a riveter and a bucker in order to put in all the rivets into various machinery, often with Boeing with the planes. And then, so that's it for that one. Now, there was pushback both for this and for women in the military. Let's see, we'll do it here. So one of the things, and this was the frustrating thing, is you had this push and pull that took place between what women, what the OWI, what society was telling them, what women enjoyed, and then all of a sudden also what society was telling them is, no, you shouldn't be doing this. So you had all of this propaganda to say, we need you. The only way the war is going to be successful is if you join. It's patriotic, you're doing your duty, it's necessary. And then you have it come in and say, no, you shouldn't be working if you were a mother. Your job is to be a mother. And so you had the opposite that started to take place, is that the argument that women, well, especially, we'll say, mothers should not work. That their job was to their children, right? And more importantly, that because of working, when they worked, this led to juvenile delinquents. Which was a new word, by the way, that wasn't really around before. That if you work as a mother, then your children are going to become juvenile delinquents. Your whole focus should be on your children. So women then ended up getting pushback, and we'll see it with the women in the Army Corps with WAC too. They get pushback from that as well. Yes, we need you to do this, but no, you're a bad parent, you're a bad person if you do. So I'm going to read just a couple of things from this. There were these articles that got put out. One was, should we draft mothers? And this was by James Madison Wood. And then the other one that we're going to look at is Mothers Our Only Hope. And I couldn't find, these are from Women's Magazine. It's a book that has all of these articles that were published in women's magazines during this period. And this was by J. Edgar Hoover. And I can find these online. If I do, I'll put them online. Otherwise, I'm just going to read you some excerpts from them, because it's very eye-opening to see
the issues that women dealt with being told, like, really two opposite directions. You had this massive dichotomy of, yes, you should do this, and this is your duty, and it's important, to, oh, you are a horrible person for doing this, you shouldn't be doing this. So I'm going to look at, should we draft mothers? You hear so many mothers say, I feel guilty because I'm not working in a war plant. These mothers have been led to believe that the rearing of children has become a non-essential activity in this country. Apparently, they do not realize that their primary responsibility is to their children and the America of tomorrow. The job of every American mother in war and peace is to care for her children. There is no more important job than in this country today. The future of our nation depends every bit as much upon the morality and health of our next generation as it does upon winning the battles in Europe and Asia. And so then it goes on to say, we have thousands of underfed, neglected children tied to clotheslines. So there was a rumor, and this may have happened occasionally, but this wasn't some widespread thing where mothers were hanging up their infant children on clotheslines. But supposedly there was a rumor going around that women were doing this to go to work. Most women who were married and had children that were going to work in the factories in the war industry either went at night, when their children were asleep, when they had older children, elementary and high school, middle school, high school kids, or had a grandparent that watched the kids while they were gone, or they went in as soon as their kids went to school. So most were not tying children up to clothespins. However, there was a fundamental issue with this, and we could put that down with it as far as lack of support, is that you didn't have, there was poor child care options. Other countries had created national child care so that the women could go drop their kids off and go work in the war industry and know their kids were taken care of, as well as some countries actually gave women hot meals to take home after a day's work because they realized what they were doing. But there was a negative image in the U.S. to child care, and more importantly, national child care especially, right, that you were a bad mother and that you couldn't take care of kids if you had to have child care. And then this idea of national child care as poor or cruel. And then just like I said, a lack of helping with home life so women could work. So instead of setting it up so women could work and that their kids were looked after, the whole mentality of the U.S. kind of created this idea that to leave your kids in childcare was a horrible thing. So you were better off. So for many women, so some women did leave their kids at home, usually not infants tied to clothespin lines, mind you, but left their, old elementary school age kids at home when they went to work, rather than put them in childcare because of that negative image and stereotype that was left with it. Most, though, tried either to work when the kids were in school or sleeping, or if they had infants, having grandparents or friends come over and watch the kids. Nonetheless, here's what it says. We have thousands of underfed, neglected children tied to clotheslines, locked in cellars, or left to run wild while mother wields a blowtorch. We have courtesans, school-age girls, diseased in mind as well as body. We have illegitimate babies. Our juvenile delinquents are learning every form of vice and crime: drunkenness, dope addiction, murder, kidnapping, rape, and robbery. While we are fighting the international gangsters, we are breeding in our own midst countless young gangsters who might have been decent, useful citizens if their mothers had not put activities outside the home ahead of their duty to their children and society. So here, this is blaming women, saying your kids are drug dealers and gangsters and murderers all because you went to work. Your daughters are prostitutes, all because you went to work, which is just absurd. And so imagine being told by society, you need to do this, this is your patriotic duty, and then you do, and they go, you are a horrible person, you have ruined your kids' lives, they are now juvenile delinquents. It goes on to say, if the draft imposes financial hardship on some mothers, why not pay them for staying at home and rearing the America of tomorrow? So this one does offer the option of saying, let's pay women to be mothers, then, if that's the necessity is for financial reasons. But at the same time, it's so blaming of mothers for working, which they had also pushed and used in propaganda. This is the basic responsibility of the American mother. She is the only one who can turn the tide of juvenile delinquency. She is the only one who can guard the home. Her patriotic duty is not on the factory front, it is on the home front. So this makes you feel guilty for working, even though then they had put that whole patriotic aspect out. Now, the next one I'm going to read a few excerpts from is the Mothers Are Only Hope. So that the one I just read was Should We Draft Mothers by James Madison Wood. I only read some excerpts from it. And then J. Edgar Hoover, Mothers Are Only Hope. This one gives examples. A certain boy at 15 was an honor student and an eager reader of the best books and magazines, healthy and athletic, and in every way normal. A year later, he is driven first to perversion and then to crime. When we see this same boy at 16 beginning to serve a life sentence for the brutal murder of his little 6-year-old sister, all because of parental incompetence and neglect during a critical period in the boy's development. We know what we are up against, what the whole country is up against. It's not juvenile delinquency, but adult delinquency. So then it's saying you're adult delinquent because you're working, and your child turns from a 15-year-old honor student to a brutal murderer. I mean, that's what's absurd with this, right? And then it goes on. At this point, the war enters the picture by placing a double burden on mothers. Fathers who might be roused by a campaign of education to become not only examples for their children but are in many instances away at war or war work, or are employed at hours which make normal family contacts impossible. If the drift of normal youth towards immorality and crime is to be stopped, mothers must do the stopping. So here then it's saying, right, like your responsibility as a mother is to stop the immorality and crime, and the only way that can do that is through mothers, and the only way you can do that is by not working. They must not only feel responsibility for setting the right example for their daughters, but must keep continually before their sons' eyes the good examples of their absent fathers. There must be no absenteeism among mothers. So then it's suggesting that from working like as a Rosa Riveter in the war industry, you're an absentee mother. The happy home, the one in which there is no delinquency, no matter what adjective you wish to place in front of it, is the home where the child rushes in. Okay, I'm going to read this paragraph. Listen carefully to this. This is their idea of what women should be doing with their children, which is just absurd. It basically is saying the woman should be a servant to their child and give them whatever they want so they don't become delinquent. So, sorry, here's what it says. The happy home, the one in which there is no delinquency, no matter what adjective you wish to place in front of it, is the home where the child rushes in and calls mother and gets a welcoming answer. If, as so often happens in wartime, the child has done a day's work, mother should be on the job to give that answer. To back it up, there should be a hot meal ready to serve and a mother fully dressed and ready to receive not only her own children, but their friends. They won't be the friends she used to know, whose mother she knew. The mother who does not provide that decent place is definitely falling down on her job. Whatever rearrangement of her own eating, sleeping, and working hours is entailed, she must be ready to give her children and their friends, no matter of how recent vintage the latter may be, hospitality and decency. If she fails to do this, she is driving them to places of their own choosing, clandestine places where they may be hospitality, but where decency is unknown. So this is saying you need to be home all the time, ready to go, fully prim and proper. This will sound familiar when we talk about women, 1950s housewife, suburban housewife. It reminds me of that. So this is pre-suburban housewife, and yet it's so similar. So you should be fully dressed, which doesn't mean like, you shouldn't be walking around naked, but what I mean by fully dressed is looking nice and refreshed, making sure you're dressed nicely, you have your makeup on, your hair is done. That's what they mean by fully dressed. Ready to receive your kid, so the instant your kid comes home, you're there to say hello, and a hot meal should be ready to serve your child as soon as they walk in the door. And you should be happy to have their friends come to the house. The mother who doesn't provide this is failing. It says whatever rearrangement of her own eating, sleeping, and working hours is entailed. So you are supposed to rearrange your working, eating, and sleeping habits to be there to serve your children. Because if you don't, they're going to go find clandestine spots and be juvenile delinquents. In short, the situation is far from hopeless for any mother who really wants to do a good job for her children and will give time and thought to working out a practical program for doing it. And if enough mothers do that time and thought, the situation is far from hopeless for the nation and its youth. So then it like shames you by saying any mother who really wanted to do this could do this. All you have to do is put a little bit of effort into it. Apparently, all you have to do is super serve your children and do whatever the hell they ask of you because of fear that they will say, well, screw you, mother, you didn't provide that hot meal for me and didn't do exactly what I demanded as soon as I came home. I'm going into an alleyway to commit murder and drug deals. Like, I mean, but that's what this is saying. That's what's so crazy about it. So you had this push and pull that was taking place, and we're going to see it with the WAC, and you'll see it in the 1950s as well. So it was kind of this double burden of you're supposed to be working, but oh, bad you for working.